Russia and China have a complex relationship. Despite publicly declaring a strong partnership, there are underlying tensions. China has refrained from condemning Russia's actions in Ukraine and abstained from critical votes at the UN. They support Russia's security concerns and have increased energy purchases, aiding Russian war efforts. Their closeness was evident even before the Ukraine invasion, with joint military patrols. It's seen as a response to perceived threats from the US and NATO in Eastern Europe and the Indo-Pacific. The Russia-China alliance is driven by their shared interests as authoritarian powers aiming to disrupt the Eurasian geopolitical order. Russia seeks control over the Eurasian steppe, while NATO expansion in Eastern Europe concerns its security. Russia's actions in Georgia and Ukraine aim to protect its borders and prevent NATO influence. China, too, perceives U.S. encirclement in the Indo-Pacific as a challenge to its security and regional influence. China's goals involve resolving the Chinese Civil War and securing energy resources, viewing the United States as a primary obstacle. Taiwan is a major non-NATO ally of the U.S., and its defense stance is ambiguous. Any military action by China would face a well-equipped Taiwan army with advanced American weapons, potentially triggering a U.S. and allied response. China's territorial disputes and claims in regions like Taiwan, the South China Sea and East China Sea, and the Himalayas contribute to its containment perception. China's reliance on maritime energy imports through the Strait of Malacca poses vulnerability. A blockade by the U.S. Navy at this choke point would greatly impact China's economy and military capabilities. To mitigate risk, China aims to diversify energy sources and reduce dependence on the Strait of Malacca. Russia perceives encirclement by NATO and the U.S. in Eastern Europe, while China lacks natural resources but has a large population and a strong economy. This creates an opportunity for collaboration. Russia gains capital and human resources from China to resist U.S. influence and expand control across the Eurasian steppe. China gains access to Russian resources, reducing vulnerability in the Strait of Malacca and enhancing strategic flexibility in the Indo-Pacific. It's worth noting that the Sino-Russian alliance is not permanent, but makes sense in the current context. Historically, China and Russia have been rivals rather than allies due to their conflicts with East Asia and European powers. China suffered territorial losses during the Century of Humiliation, including British control over Hong Kong and Japanese occupation of Taiwan and Manchuria. The Chinese Communist Party considers this period to have ended in 1949 with their victory in the Civil War, but some occasions, like Japan's total control over Taiwan since 1895, persisted. Hong Kong was peacefully returned to China in 1997. Interestingly, one of China's unequal treaties was with their current partner, Russia. In 1858, Russia took advantage of China's weakness and acquired a large piece of land, Outer Manchuria, through a forced treaty. This region became strategically important for Russia, housing cities like Khabarovsk and Vladivostok, key centers for the Russian Far East and Pacific Fleet. The treaty limited China's access to the Sea of Japan, confining them to the East and South China Seas. Many Chinese nationalists view the loss of Outer Manchuria as another example of unequal treaties. Mao Zedong also expressed dissatisfaction with Russia's annexation and its unresolved status. Tensions between China and the Soviet Union heightened in the 1960s due to their differences in their interpretations of Marxism-Leninism. The Sino-Soviet border crisis emerged over the Amur and Ussuri rivers, with a dispute over the ownership of islands within them. The Soviets claimed all the islands, while China argued that the boundary ran through the midpoint of the rivers, making the islands on the Chinese side belong to China. In 1969, Chinese and Soviet troops clashed over the islands of Shenbao and Damansky, bringing the two communist countries close to nuclear war. Casualties occurred on both sides, although the crisis eventually subsided without full-scale conflict. The border remained disputed until its formal demarcation in 1991. However, the border agreement does not guarantee perpetual agreement, especially considering Russia's historical claims-based actions in Ukraine. This raises concerns about potential future moves by China regarding Outer Manchuria. Russia's actions in Ukraine highlight the unpredictability of historical claims and their impact on territorial disputes. Furthermore, the divergence between Moscow and Beijing extends beyond historical strains over Outer Manchuria. After the Soviet Union's collapse, Central Asian countries that were once under Russian influence have gravitated towards China, distancing themselves from Russia. China has invested significant effort into its Belt and Road Initiative, seeking to revive the ancient Silk Road routes across Central Asia. This region possesses abundant hydrocarbon resources, including oil and gas, which are in high demand for China's resource-dependent economy. To meet its energy needs, China has supported the construction of pipelines from countries like Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, and Kazakhstan, allowing the eastward flow of oil and gas to China. As a result, China has reduced its heavy reliance on liquefied natural gas imports through the vulnerable Malacca Strait by importing approximately 15% of its total natural gas demand. It's become the largest customer for natural gas supplies from Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan, countries that were once under Moscow's rule. This has led to intense competition between China and Russia in the expanding natural gas trade in China, as Russia's market in Europe faces challenges due to the Ukraine conflict. China's flourishing capital and industrial base have surpassed Russia in trade volumes with all Central Asian states since the dissolution of the Soviet Union. As a result, the Central Asian states now have a viable economic alternative to Russia, leading Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, and Tajikistan to opt out of joining Russia's Eurasian Economic Union and actively participate in China's Belt and Road Initiative. This situation poses a complex challenge for Russia. Geographical control over Central Asia has long been a foreign policy objective for Moscow, given the region's historical significance as a major invasion route into the vast Eurasian steppe. The strategic flat gap in modern Uzbekistan, situated between the hostile Karakum Desert and the towering Tian Shan Mountains, has historically facilitated easy passage through this crucial region. However, Russia also needs to consider China's growing interest in Central Asia. Beyond acquiring hydrocarbon resources, China aims to stabilize its volatile Xinjiang province, which has witnessed internal violence and instability rooted in ethnic and religious differences within the majority Han Chinese government. Thus, Russia must navigate its aspirations for regional control while acknowledging China's multifaceted interests in Central Asia. In the early 2010s, the situation in Xinjiang reached a critical point, leading the Chinese Communist Party to respond with a severe crackdown. By around 2012, the Chinese People's Armed Police established a permanent presence near the Tajikistan border, specifically along the Tajik side of the Wakhan corridor. This narrow strip of land in Afghanistan has a minimal connection to China. The objective of this move was to prevent the infiltration of Islamist militants and weapons from Afghanistan and Pakistan into turbulent Xinjiang. Tajikistan's decision to allow another foreign power, namely China, to deploy a military on its territory without seeking permission from Russia was indeed a significant blow to Moscow's influence in Central Asia. It indicated the shifting dynamics and the growing displacement of Russian influence by China in the region. However, Russia, for now, seems to accept this new reality, as its primary focus remains countering what it perceives as the Western threat across the European plain. Losing ground to China in Central Asia appears to be an acceptable cost to maintain that focus. Another potential point of divergence between Russia and China in the near future relates to water scarcity. China faces a severe shortage of available water, which is expected to become one of its most significant challenges in this century. Despite being home to a large population, China controls a relatively small percentage of the world's surface freshwater resources. The North China Plain, with major cities like Beijing and Tianjin and a population of over 400 million people, is particularly vulnerable to water scarcity. The region heavily relies on transporting water through pipes and aqueducts from other areas or sourcing it internationally. However, the impact of climate change is exacerbating the situation, making it increasingly difficult to meet the water demands over time. In 2022, China experienced a record-breaking drought, leading to the lowest recorded rainfall in the Yangtze River Valley since 1961. Disturbing images circulated showing parts of China's longest and most important river running dry, indicating an impending water crisis in the country. As China faces a severe shortage of water resources, its attention turns northward to the Russian Far East, particularly the Baikal Lake, which holds a vast amount of fresh water. Despite China's interest in acquiring water from the Baikal Lake and plans to build a pipeline, protests from local Russian population have halted the project. The challenge lies in balancing China's water scarcity crisis with Russia's protective stance over its resources. The ongoing interaction between China and Russia regarding water and energy resources will be important to monitor. Conflicting interests and environmental concerns may lead to tensions, especially as climate change exacerbates resource strains. How China manages its water concerns and how Russia navigates its influence in Central Asia will shape the future dynamics between the two nations. The demographic imbalance in the Far East, with Russia relying on Chinese investment in labor, raises concerns for Moscow. Russia's economic dependence on China could lead to a shift in the balance of power if a less China-friendly government takes power. China may leverage its position as Russia's largest energy customer to assert historical territorial claims, potentially leaving Russia vulnerable. The ongoing war in Ukraine has further weakened Russia and highlighted its dependence on China. As Russia seeks Chinese support, it risks compromising its sovereignty and geopolitical interests. China carefully watches the situation, assessing its own strategic interests in the process. The evolving dynamics between Russia, China, and the United States will not only shape the region, but also have global geopolitical implications. The outcome of the war in Ukraine, territorial disputes, demographics, and resource scarcity will influence the balance of power in the coming years. Russia's reliance on China due to the war in Ukraine weakens its military and economic position. Limited access to Western capital and sanctions further complicate Russia's situation, making it increasingly dependent on China for support. However, Russia is cautious about the long-term implication of deepening ties with China and its potential impact on sovereignty and geopolitical interests. China recognizes the opportunity to gain influence over Russia as its primary energy customer, but also understands the risks of a deepening dependence on China for Russia. China's strategic interests lie in regional stability and securing economic and geopolitical advantages. It remains adaptable and may reassess its position based on changes in the Russian government or its own strategic needs. The interplay between these influential nations will shape the global geopolitical landscape.